He looked her up and down, then let the coffee drip from his ruined jacket onto her worn shoes, and he laughed. Not a small laugh, a loud cutting laugh that turned every head in that marble lobby. "People like you," Daniel Whitmore said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear, "should learn your place before you walk into a building like this." He didn't know he had just insulted the one woman in New York who could end his entire empire with a single phone call. He had no idea the poor stranger in front of him owned the future of everything he loved. Before we go any further, if stories about pride, karma, and second chances move your heart, please subscribe to this channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because the ending will surprise you. And do me one small favor. Leave a comment and tell me the city where you're watching from right now so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The morning Daniel Whitmore ruined a stranger's day, he had no idea he was ruining his own life. It was a cold Tuesday in Manhattan, the kind of morning where the wind cut between the skyscrapers like a blade, and the sidewalks were packed with people rushing to jobs that barely paid their rent. Above all of them, 40 floors up, sat the gleaming glass tower of Whitmore Enterprises, and inside that tower, Daniel Whitmore believed he was the most important man alive. He walked into the lobby that morning the way he walked into every room, with his chin lifted, his shoulders squared, and his eyes already looking past everyone who wasn't worth his attention. His suit had cost more than most of his employees earned in a month. His watch cost more than their cars. And Daniel wore both like armor because deep down in a place he never let anyone see, Daniel Whitmore was terrified of one thing above all else. He was terrified of being ordinary. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," said the young man at the front desk, half rising from his chair. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't even slow down. To Daniel, saying good morning to a receptionist was like thanking a doorknob for turning. The boy sat back down, his face falling, and told himself for the 100th time that this was just how powerful men were. At the elevator, Daniel checked his reflection in the polished steel doors. He liked what he saw. 34 years old, sharp jaw, expensive haircut, a face made for magazine covers. In 6 weeks, he told himself he would close the biggest deal of his career, and then the whole city would finally understand exactly who Daniel Whitmore was. Because the truth was, Whitmore Enterprises was drowning. Daniel had inherited the company from his uncle 2 years earlier, and he had spent those 2 years spending money the company didn't have. Private jets he called business travel. A penthouse he called an investment. Parties he called networking. And now the accounts were bleeding. The investors were nervous, and the banks were beginning to whisper the word that terrified Daniel more than death itself. Bankruptcy. There was only one way out. Carter Global Holdings. The most secretive, most powerful investment firm in America. A company so private that no one had ever photographed its owner. A company so rich it could swallow Whitmore Enterprises whole and not even notice the taste. If Daniel could secure an investment from Carter Global, his company would be saved, his name would be made, and every man who had ever doubted him would have to look him in the eye and admit they were wrong. The meeting was in 6 weeks, and Daniel intended to be perfect. So on that cold Tuesday morning, with his mind full of deals and dreams, Daniel Whitmore stepped out of the elevator on the 40th floor, walked toward the glass conference room where his team was waiting, and collided with a young woman carrying a stack of folders and a cup of coffee. The coffee went everywhere, down the front of his jacket, across the sleeve of his shirt, onto the silk tie that had cost him $400. For one full second, the entire floor went silent. Every employee froze, phones stopped ringing, keyboards stopped clicking, because they all knew in that horrible frozen second exactly what was about to happen. Daniel looked down at the brown stains spreading across his chest. Then he looked up at the woman who had caused it. She was young, maybe 30, with tired eyes and a face that was trying very hard to stay calm. Her clothes were plain and clearly secondhand, a gray coat with a small tear at the pocket, a blouse that had been ironed too many times, and shoes that had been resoled instead of replaced. Her handbag was cheap vinyl cracked at the corner. Everything about her said the same quiet thing: this is a woman who does not have money. And Daniel, who measured every human being on earth by exactly that one thing, felt something rise in his chest that he mistook for righteousness. "I'm so sorry," the woman said quickly, already reaching for the napkins in her bag. "I didn't see you. I was rushing. Please, let me help." "Don't touch me," Daniel snapped. She froze her hand halfway out. "Do you have any idea," he said slowly, his voice getting louder with every word, "how much this suit costs?" "I'm sorry, I'll pay for the cleaning, I promise," she said. "I have a meeting to get to, but I can leave you my information and I'll cover everything." Daniel laughed. It was that laugh, the loud, cruel one, the one that made people flinch. "You'll pay for it," he said. "Look at you. Look at those shoes. You couldn't pay for one of the buttons on this jacket." He turned to the crowd of employees who were pretending not to watch. "She's going to pay for it," he announced as if it were the funniest thing he had ever heard. The woman's cheeks went red, but she didn't shrink. She stood there holding her folders against her chest like a shield, and she looked Daniel Whitmore straight in the eye. "There's no reason to speak to me like that," she said quietly. And that was the moment everything got worse. Because Daniel Whitmore had many flaws, but the one that would destroy him was this. He could not stand to be corrected by someone he considered beneath him. A rich man contradicting him was a rival. A poor woman contradicting him was an insult to the entire order of the universe. "Excuse me," he said. "I said there's no reason to be cruel," she repeated. "It was an accident. I apologized. I offered to pay. That should be enough for any decent person." "Any decent person," Daniel repeated, stepping closer. "You're going to lecture me about decency in my building, wearing shoes that have been repaired more times than I can count." He shook his head, and his voice dropped into something colder and more dangerous. "Let me tell you something about how the world works, sweetheart. People like me build things. People like you clean up after us. That's the arrangement. And when someone like you walks into a place like this and dares to open your mouth, it tells me nobody ever taught you your place." The woman's jaw tightened. A few of the employees looked away ashamed. One young woman near the printer had tears in her eyes, but she said nothing because she needed her job, and everyone knew what happened to people who crossed Daniel Whitmore. "What's your name?" Daniel demanded. The woman hesitated for just a moment. "Emily," she said. "Emily what?" "Just Emily." Daniel smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Just Emily," he repeated. "And what exactly are you doing on my floor, just Emily?" "I'm here for a meeting," she said, "with the operations team about a contract." "A contract?" Daniel almost laughed again. He looked at her cheap bag, her worn coat, her tired face, and he decided in that instant that she was lying. That she was some temp, some nobody, some low-level clerk who had wandered onto the executive floor and had the nerve to spill coffee on him and then argue about it. "There's no meeting with you," he said. "There's no contract with someone dressed like that. You know what I think. I think you don't belong here at all. I think you snuck up here to see how the other half lives, and you got clumsy, and now you're embarrassed and you're trying to talk your way out of it." "That's not true," Emily said. "Prove it," Daniel said. And here is the thing that no one in that room understood. Emily could have proven it. Very easily. She could have said 7 words, and Daniel Whitmore's face would have turned white, and his knees would have gone weak, and he would have spent the rest of his life apologizing. She could have reached into that cheap, cracked handbag, pulled out a single card, and ended him where he stood. Because Emily was not a temp. Emily was not a clerk. Emily was not a nobody. Emily Carter was the sole owner of Carter Global Holdings, the invisible billionaire, the secret heiress, the one person on earth who would decide in 6 weeks whether Whitmore Enterprises lived or died. She had come to that building quietly in her plain clothes under a false name as part of a habit she had kept for 3 long years. She liked to see companies the way ordinary people saw them from the ground floor before she ever decided to invest a single dollar. She liked to watch how powerful men treated the people who couldn't do anything for them. And now she was watching Daniel Whitmore. She was learning everything she needed to know. But she said none of it. She simply lifted her chin, and she said in a voice that was steadier than Daniel expected, "I don't have to prove anything to you." That was the wrong answer. Or maybe it was exactly the right one, because it pushed Daniel past the edge of the cliff he had been walking along his whole life. "You're right," he said. "You don't have to prove anything to me. You just have to leave." He turned and raised his voice so the entire floor could hear him. "Where's the manager? Who let this person up here? Somebody find out who's responsible for security today, because we clearly have a problem." "Please," Emily said, and for the first time, there was something soft in her voice, something almost like a plea. But it was not a plea for herself. "Don't do this. Not because of me. Because there are people in this room watching you, and they're going to remember how you treated a stranger who had no power over you. That's the moment that shows who a man really is. Not how he treats the people he wants something from, how he treats the people he thinks can't touch him." For one strange second, Daniel paused. Something in her words landed somewhere deep, somewhere he didn't like, somewhere he had buried a long time ago. For 1 second, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Then he crushed it, because doubt was for weak men, and Daniel Whitmore had spent his whole life making sure no one ever mistook him for a weak man. "Get her out of my building," he said. 2 security guards appeared. They were big men, both of them clearly uncomfortable because they had heard the whole thing, and neither one wanted any part of it. But a job is a job, and Daniel Whitmore signed their checks. "Ma'am," one of them said gently, "if you'll come with us." Emily looked at Daniel one last time. She wasn't angry. That was the strange thing. If she had been angry, Daniel could have understood it. Anger he knew how to handle. Anger he could fight. But Emily wasn't angry. She was disappointed. She looked at him the way a parent looks at a child who has broken something precious, not out of malice, but out of carelessness, out of never having been taught to value it in the first place. And that look would stay with Daniel Whitmore for weeks. It would sit in the back of his mind, quiet and patient, waiting. "You'll remember me," Emily said softly. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And then she gathered her folders, straightened her worn coat, and walked toward the elevator with her head held high, flanked by 2 guards who felt sick with shame, past 24 employees who would talk about this moment for years, while Daniel Whitmore stood in the middle of his marble kingdom with coffee drying on his $400 tie and a satisfied smile on his face. He thought he had won. He had no idea he had just lost everything. The elevator doors closed, and Emily Carter stood alone inside, staring at her reflection in the polished steel. She let out a slow breath. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling, not from fear, from something older and harder to name. Because Daniel Whitmore had not just insulted her, he had reminded her of a truth she had spent 3 years trying to understand. That kindness is not natural to the powerful. That respect, real respect, the kind that costs something, is rarer than gold. And that most of the men who ran the world would treat a struggling stranger like garbage the moment they believed no one important was watching. But someone important had been watching. She had. The elevator descended, and with each floor, Emily let a little more of the tired stranger fall away. By the time the doors opened in the parking garage far below the street, something in her had changed. Her shoulders were straighter, her eyes were sharper. She walked across the concrete, not like a woman who had just been thrown out of a building, but like a woman who owned the building, the block, and half the city around it. A black car was waiting. A man in his 60s stepped out of the back seat, tall, silver-haired, with the calm face of a man who had spent 40 years around powerful people and had stopped being impressed by any of it. His name was Richard Hayes, and he had been the chief advisor to the Carter family since before Emily was born. He had watched Emily grow up. He had stood beside her father's coffin. And he was in a world full of people who wanted something from her, the only man Emily Carter completely trusted. He took one look at her face and knew something had happened. "Miss Carter," he said, "what's wrong?" Emily got into the car and closed the door before she answered. For a moment, she just sat there staring at the cracked vinyl handbag in her lap, the cheap prop she wore like a costume. "I found out everything I needed to know about Daniel Whitmore," she said finally. Richard studied her. And he had me thrown out of his building," Emily said, "in front of 40 employees for spilling coffee on his jacket." A thin, tired smile crossed her lips. "He told me people like me should learn our place." Richard's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened, and his hands folded slowly in his lap. He had known Emily her whole life. He had watched her turn down marriage proposals from senators' sons and business offers from men worth more than small countries. He had watched her walk away from a life of unlimited luxury to live in a Brooklyn apartment and work temporary jobs, all because she wanted to understand what money did to people. He had never once questioned her judgment, but he had also promised her dying father that he would protect her. And something about the look in her eyes right now made the old man's protective instincts flare to life. "Say the word," Richard said quietly, "and the deal is dead. We pull out of Whitmore Enterprises tonight. Without our investment, that company is bankrupt in 90 days. Daniel Whitmore loses everything: his penthouse, his jet, his name. I can have the paperwork drawn up before dinner." He paused. "No one insults you and keeps their kingdom, Miss Carter, not while I'm alive." For a long moment, Emily didn't answer. And here is where you might expect the story to become a simple tale of revenge. A rich woman humiliated by a cruel man destroys him with the snap of her fingers. It would have been easy. It would have been satisfying. And a lesser person would have done exactly that. But Emily Carter shook her head. "No," she said. Richard blinked. "No. If I destroy him," Emily said slowly, "then I'm no better than he is. If I use my money to crush a man who hurt me, then money is still the thing that decides everything. And that's the exact sickness I've spent 3 years trying to understand. Daniel Whitmore thinks power is the ability to hurt people who can't hurt you back." She turned and looked at Richard, and her eyes were clear and calm and just a little bit dangerous. "I want to teach him what power really is." Richard tilted his head. "And what is it?" Emily looked out the window at the towering city, at the millions of people rushing through the cold, most of them invisible to men like Daniel Whitmore. "Power," she said, "is the ability to lift someone up or let them fall, and to choose lifting even when falling would feel better." She was quiet for a moment. "He humiliated a poor woman he thought was powerless," she said. "In 6 weeks, that same woman is going to walk into a ballroom full of the most powerful people in America. And Daniel Whitmore is going to stand up in front of all of them and beg for an investment. And he's going to look up, and he's going to see me." Richard slowly began to smile the way an old chess player smiles when he finally understands the move his opponent has been building toward for hours. "You're not going to destroy him," he said. "No," said Emily. "I'm going to let him destroy himself. And then if there's anything human left in him, I'm going to give him a chance to become a better man." She looked down at the cheap handbag again. "Because I don't want revenge, Richard. I want the truth. I want to know if a man like that can change. Because if he can't, then I'm not sure any of us can." The car pulled out of the garage and into the flow of the city, and behind them, 40 floors up, Daniel Whitmore was already forgetting the whole thing had ever happened. He was in the executive bathroom, dabbing at his ruined tie with a wet paper towel, laughing with 2 junior executives about the crazy woman who had spilled coffee on him. "Did you see her shoes?" he was saying. "I mean, who lets someone dressed like that up to the 40th floor? This is a financial institution, not a soup kitchen." The 2 junior executives laughed along, because laughing along was how you survived around Daniel Whitmore. But one of them, a young man named Marcus, felt something twist in his stomach as he laughed. Marcus had grown up poor. Marcus had a mother who cleaned office buildings just like this one, and who wore shoes she had resoled 3 times because a new pair was a luxury the family couldn't afford. And when Daniel had looked at that woman and seen nothing but a joke, Marcus had seen his own mother. He said nothing. He needed the job, but he would remember. Everyone would remember. That was the thing about Daniel Whitmore. He left a trail of small cruelties behind him wherever he walked, and he never once looked back to see the wreckage. He fired people for being late when the train broke down. He mocked the accents of the cleaning staff. He humiliated interns for asking questions. He once made a 50-year-old accountant cry in front of the entire finance department over a mistake that turned out to be his own. And in his mind, none of it counted, because none of those people mattered, because none of those people had money or power or a name that opened doors. He had built his entire life on one simple belief, that the value of a human being could be read on a price tag, and that belief was about to cost him everything. Later that afternoon, Daniel got a call that lifted his mood even higher. It was from Carter Global Holdings. The meeting was confirmed. 6 weeks from that day, at the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, the owner of Carter Global would appear in public for the very first time to finalize the investment. It was unheard of. The mysterious billionaire never appeared in person. But for this deal, Daniel was told the owner would make an exception. Daniel hung up the phone and let out a whoop of joy that echoed through his penthouse office. "This is it," he said to himself, staring out the window at the city sprawled beneath him. "This is the moment everything changes." He was more right than he could possibly know. He poured himself an expensive drink and began to plan. He would buy a new suit, the best money could buy. He would hire a speech coach. He would rehearse every word until it was perfect. He would walk into that ballroom, and he would charm the invisible billionaire, and he would save his company, and he would become one of the most powerful men in New York. And every person who had ever doubted him, every teacher who had called him arrogant, every relative who had said his uncle was a fool to leave him the company, every one of them would finally have to admit that Daniel Whitmore was somebody. He never once wondered what the billionaire might be like. He never once considered that the person who held his entire future in their hands might have already met him, might have already seen him at his absolute worst, might have already decided exactly what kind of man he was. That night, across the river in Brooklyn, Emily Carter sat in the small apartment she had lived in for 3 years. It was clean and plain, with a second-hand couch and a kitchen table she had bought at a thrift store. To anyone who saw it, it looked like the home of a woman who was just barely getting by. And that was exactly how Emily wanted it. She made herself a simple dinner, the way she had learned to do, and she sat by the window and thought about her father. Robert Carter had built Carter Global Holdings from almost nothing. He had started as a poor kid from a coal town in Pennsylvania, a boy who had gone to bed hungry more nights than he could count, and he had built an empire through nothing but brilliance and relentless work. But the thing Emily remembered most about her father was not his wealth. It was the way he treated people. He knew the name of every janitor in every building he owned. He remembered their children's names, their birthdays, their struggles. He tipped waiters like they were family, and he treated cleaning ladies like they were queens because he had never forgotten where he came from. "Emily," he told her once when she was a little girl, "anyone can be kind to people who can do something for them. That's not kindness, that's business. Real kindness is how you treat the people who can do nothing for you at all. Watch a man treat a waiter, and you'll know his entire soul." Those words had shaped her whole life. When her father died suddenly of a heart attack, Emily inherited billions. And overnight, she watched the world change around her. Suddenly, everyone loved her. Suddenly, she had 100 new friends. Suddenly, men who had never noticed her before were sending flowers and proposing marriage and swearing eternal devotion. And Emily, who was smart in the way her father had been smart, saw exactly what was happening. None of them loved her. They loved the money. They loved the name. If she had been poor, not one of them would have crossed the street to help her. So she made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She disappeared. She created a false identity. She moved to Brooklyn. She took temporary jobs under the name Emily No Last Name. And she went out into the world as an ordinary struggling woman to find out one thing. Would anyone treat her with dignity if she had nothing to offer them in return? For 3 years, she had lived in 2 worlds. Some days she was the invisible billionaire making decisions that moved millions of dollars and shaped the fates of companies. Other days, she was just Emily, riding the subway, standing in line at the pharmacy, being ignored and dismissed, and looked down upon by people who had no idea who she was. And what she had learned in those 3 years had broken her heart a little, because most people were not kind. Not really. Not when they thought there was nothing to gain. She had seen it 100 times. The way store clerks talked down to her when she wore old clothes. The way well-dressed men pushed past her on the sidewalk like she was furniture. The way waiters gave her the worst tables and the slowest service. Kindness, she had learned, was the rarest currency in the world, and most people spent it only where they expected a return. But she had also learned something else, something that kept her going. Because for every cruel person, there was one who surprised her. A bus driver who waited an extra 30 seconds when he saw her running. A stranger who gave up his seat. a co-worker at a temp job who shared her lunch when Emily pretended she'd forgotten hers. Small acts of grace from people who had nothing and expected nothing. And those people Emily came to understand were the truly rich ones. They just didn't know it. Which brought her back to Daniel Whitmore. She thought about him now, sitting by her window in the dark, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt sorry for him, not because of what was coming, because of what he already was, because a man who could only respect people with money was a man who would never, not once in his entire life, know if he was truly loved or simply used. He would go to his grave surrounded by people who wanted his money and never once know real friendship, real loyalty, real love. He had built himself a golden cage and thrown away the key, and he thought it was a throne. "You poor, poor man," Emily whispered to the darkness. And then she opened her laptop and she began to work. Over the next 6 weeks, quietly and carefully, Emily Carter learned everything there was to know about Daniel Whitmore. She had the resources of one of the most powerful investment firms in America, and she used them. She read every financial statement Whitmore Enterprises had ever filed. She saw the reckless spending, the vanity purchases dressed up as business expenses, the money siphoned into Daniel's personal accounts. But more than that, she looked into the human side of the company. She had her people quietly interview former employees. And what she found made her stomach turn. There was the single mother who had been fired for missing 3 days when her son was in the hospital. There was the elderly security guard, a man who had worked there for 20 years, let go without a pension 6 months before he could retire because Daniel wanted to cut costs. There was the young intern who had a breakdown after months of Daniel's public humiliations. Story after story after story of a man who used the people beneath him and threw them away like trash. But then buried in all that darkness, Emily found something that surprised her. She found the other side of Daniel Whitmore, the side even Daniel didn't seem to remember. Because 10 years earlier, before the money, before the power, before he inherited the company and let it turn him into a monster, Daniel Whitmore had been a different man. Emily found records of a young Daniel who had volunteered at a shelter for homeless veterans every weekend for 2 years. She found a story from an old newspaper about a college student named Daniel Whitmore who had dived into a freezing river to save a drowning child and had asked for no reward, given no interview, and walked away before anyone could even get his name. Emily stared at that story for a long time because it told her something important. It told her that the cruelty wasn't the truth of Daniel Whitmore. The cruelty was a wound. Somewhere along the way, this young man who once risked his life for a stranger had learned to believe that kindness was weakness, that the only thing that kept you safe was money, that the only way to matter was to make others feel small. Somewhere along the way, someone or something had taught Daniel Whitmore to be afraid, and he had covered that fear in expensive suits and cruel laughter, and he had forgotten the boy who once jumped into a freezing river without a second thought. "There's still someone in there," Emily said quietly, closing the laptop. "The question is whether he can find his way back." And she made a decision. She would not simply humiliate Daniel Whitmore. That would be too easy and too cruel, and it would only prove his own philosophy right, that the powerful crush the weak, and that's just how the world works. No, she would do something far harder and far more dangerous and far more likely to fail. She would give him a mirror. She would let him stand in that ballroom at the height of his arrogance, in his brand new suit, ready to charm the invisible billionaire, and she would let the mask fall from her own face. And in that one terrible moment, Daniel Whitmore would see everything. He would see the woman he had thrown out of his building. He would see the stranger he had mocked for her shoes. He would understand all at once that the person who held his entire future in her hands was the person he had treated like garbage. And then, and only then, would Emily find out what kind of man he really was. Would he crumble in shame and beg? Would he lash out in anger? Would he try to lie his way out of it? Or would he somewhere deep down feel the sting of a truth he had spent years avoiding and finally begin the long journey back to the man he used to be? Emily didn't know. And that uncertainty was the whole point, because if she already knew the answer, there would be no reason to give him the chance. The night before the meeting, Emily stood in front of the mirror in a very different apartment, a penthouse suite that even Daniel Whitmore couldn't have afforded. And she held up 2 things. In one hand, the cheap vinyl handbag with the cracked corner, the costume she had worn for 3 years. In the other hand, an elegant black gown that had been custom-made in Paris. For a moment, she just stood there holding both lives in her 2 hands. Then she set the handbag down gently, almost lovingly, the way you'd set down an old friend. "Thank you," she whispered to it. "You taught me everything." And she picked up the gown. Across the river in his penthouse, Daniel Whitmore stood in front of his own mirror, adjusting the collar of a suit that had cost him $12,000. He had rehearsed his speech 40 times. He had researched every rumor about the mysterious owner of Carter Global. He was ready. Tomorrow night, he would save his company, secure his legacy, and finally become the man he had always believed he was destined to be. He smiled at his reflection. "Tomorrow," he said, "everything changes." He was right, but not in a single way he imagined, because tomorrow night, in a ballroom full of the most powerful people in America, Daniel Whitmore was going to look up from his rehearsed speech, and he was going to see a pair of eyes he recognized. And in that instant, the whole world he had built on money and cruelty and fear was going to come crashing down around his ears. He just didn't know it yet. He slept well that night, the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who has never once questioned himself. And 40 floors up in a different tower across the dark river that separated their 2 worlds, Emily. Carter lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking not about revenge, but about a boy who had once jumped into a freezing river to save a drowning child, and wondering if that boy was still alive somewhere inside the cruel man who had thrown her out of his building. She hoped he was. For his sake, she hoped he was. Because the choice Daniel Whitmore made tomorrow night, in front of all those people in that one shattering moment of truth, was going to decide the entire rest of his life. And he had no idea it was coming. The morning of the meeting, Daniel Whitmore woke up at 5, and for the first time in his adult life, his hands were shaking. He told himself it was excitement. He stood at his bathroom mirror, gripping the edge of the marble sink, and he stared at his own reflection until the shaking stopped. This was the biggest day of his life. Of course, his hands were shaking. Any man's hands would shake. He splashed cold water on his face and gave himself the speech he had given himself 1,000 times before. "You are Daniel Whitmore," he said out loud. "You don't beg, you don't crawl, you walk into that room and you make them want you." But something was wrong and he couldn't name it. All week, a strange feeling had been following him around like a shadow. It came to him in quiet moments. In the elevator, at his desk, late at night, in the half-second before sleep. It was the memory of a face, a woman's face, tired and plain looking at him, not with anger but with disappointment, and a voice quiet and steady saying words he couldn't get out of his head. "You'll remember me." He shook it off. He always shook it off. Some crazy woman who spilled coffee on him weeks ago. Why on earth was he still thinking about her? He had thrown out 100 people over the years and never given any of them a second thought. But this one wouldn't leave, and it made him angry the way a splinter you can't find makes you angry, a small thing digging at you from a place you can't reach. He got dressed with the care of a soldier preparing for battle. The $12,000 suit, the handmade shoes, the watch worth more than his assistant's yearly salary. He looked in the mirror one last time, and he saw exactly what he wanted to see. A winner. "Tonight," he said, "everything changes." At his office, the whole day crawled by like a wounded animal. Daniel couldn't focus. He rehearsed his speech until the words lost their meaning. He snapped at his assistant twice. He fired off angry emails about things that didn't matter. And underneath all of it, that shadow kept following him, that tired face, that quiet voice, until finally around 3 in the afternoon, he did something he almost never did. He called Marcus into his office. Marcus, the young executive who had grown up poor, whose mother cleaned buildings just like this one. Daniel didn't know any of that about him. He just knew Marcus was sharp and did what he was told. "Marcus," Daniel said, "you remember that woman? The one who spilled coffee on me a few weeks back?" Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "Yes, sir. I remember." "Do we know who she was? Did anyone ever find out?" Marcus hesitated, and here was a small moment that no one would ever notice, but it mattered. because Marcus had in fact found out something. After that day, he had gone down to the operations team, the ones the woman had claimed to have a meeting with, and he had asked. And the operations manager had gone pale and said there had indeed been a woman scheduled to come by a representative doing a preliminary review, though she'd never given her name, and that after she failed to show, they'd received a very strange, very cold phone call from someone very high up, telling them the review was being handled differently now. Marcus had put the pieces together in a way that made him afraid, but he had said nothing because being right about something that terrifying was not the kind of thing that helped a man keep his job. "No, sir," Marcus lied. Nobody knew who she was, probably just someone who wandered up. Daniel nodded, satisfied. "That's what I figured. Some nobody." But even as he said it, that word felt wrong in his mouth. Nobody. He'd been so sure. Why did the certainty feel so thin now? "Will that be all, sir?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," Daniel said, waving him off. Then, as Marcus reached the door, "Marcus." "Sir." Daniel opened his mouth. For one strange second, he almost said something real. He almost asked, "Do you think I was too hard on her?" He almost admitted that the face wouldn't leave him alone. But Daniel Whitmore didn't ask questions like that. Daniel Whitmore didn't have doubts. So he swallowed it. "Nothing," he said. "Get back to work." Marcus left, and he closed the door very softly behind him, and out in the hallway he leaned against the wall and let out a long, slow breath. Because Marcus had a bad feeling about tonight, a feeling he couldn't explain. And Marcus, it would turn out, was the only person in the entire building whose instincts were completely correct. Across the river, Emily Carter was not shaking. She sat perfectly still while a stylist arranged her hair, and her mind was calm and clear and focused like the surface of a lake before dawn. Richard Hayes stood by the window watching her in the mirror, and he had known her long enough to read the stillness for what it was. Not peace, resolve. "You could still change your mind," he said quietly. Emily met his eyes in the mirror. "About what?" "About all of it, the reveal, the theater of it. You could simply have me present the terms in a boardroom next week and never see his face at all. It would be cleaner." "It would be easier," Emily agreed, "but it wouldn't tell me anything." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing he had been holding back for 6 weeks. "Miss Carter, I've served your family for 40 years. I served your father, God rest him, and now I serve you, and I would walk through fire for you. So I hope you'll forgive me for saying this." He paused. "You're doing this for a man who threw you out of a building, and I've watched you these 3 years, watched you get treated like dirt by people who weren't worth the shine on your shoes, and I've never once said a word. But this one, this Whitmore, he doesn't deserve a chance from you. He deserves the door, and I'm afraid you're going to stand in front of him tonight and offer him grace, and he's going to spit on it." Emily was quiet for a long time. "Maybe he will," she finally said. "But here's what I've learned, Richard. If I only give chances to people who deserve them, I'm not giving chances at all. I'm giving rewards. Grace that has to be earned isn't grace. It's a transaction. And I've spent my whole life around transactions." She looked down at her hands. "My father gave chances to people who didn't deserve them. That's how he built the company. Half his best executives were people everyone else had written off. He used to say the world is full of good men wearing the armor of bad men, and the trick is to find the crack in the armor and speak to the man inside." Richard swallowed. "And if there's no man inside—" "Then I'll know," Emily said simply. "And I'll withdraw every dollar, and Whitmore Enterprises will collapse, and Daniel will lose everything, not because I destroyed him, but because he never gave me a reason not to. Either way, Richard, I win. Because either I save a man, or I learn the truth about one. And the truth is always worth knowing." Richard looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his old eyes. Something like pride, and something like grief, because she reminded him so much of her father in that instant that it almost hurt to look at her. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. Emily's composure cracked just slightly, just for a second. "I hope so," she whispered. "I hope he's watching." Then she stood, and she smoothed the front of the elegant black gown, and the moment of softness was gone, sealed away behind the calm face of a woman who was about to walk into a room full of the most powerful people in America and change the course of one man's life. "It's time," she said. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was already filling with people by 7 o'clock. This was not an ordinary business gathering. Word had spread that the invisible owner of Carter Global Holdings would appear in public for the very first time, and every important person in New York finance had found a reason to be there. Senators, media moguls, bank presidents, old money and new money, all of it gathered under crystal chandeliers, all of it buzzing with the same question. Who was the mysterious billionaire? What did they look like? Where had they been hiding all these years? And moving through that crowd, shaking hands, laughing his practiced laugh, working the room like the winner he believed himself to be, was Daniel Whitmore. He was magnificent, and he knew it. He had never felt more alive. Everywhere he went, people wanted to talk to him, because everyone knew that tonight was Daniel's night, that Carter Global was here for him, that in a matter of hours, he would be one of the most important men in the room. He shook a senator's hand. He accepted congratulations from a bank president. He kissed the cheeks of women whose husbands were worth hundreds of millions. "Big night, Daniel," said an older man, a real estate legend named Harold Voss, clapping him on the shoulder. "You must be nervous, meeting the ghost himself. Nobody's ever laid eyes on the owner of Carter Global. You know they say it's an old man 100 years old keeps himself hidden like some kind of pharaoh?" Daniel laughed. "Whoever it is, Harold, by the end of tonight, they're going to be my new best friend." Harold chuckled and moved on, and Daniel took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and let himself feel it, the sweetness of the moment, the certainty of triumph. He looked around the ballroom at all these powerful people, and he thought, "This is where I belong. This is what I was made for." And some part of him, the small frightened part he never let anyone see, finally felt safe. Because in this room, surrounded by wealth, no one could ever call him ordinary. That was the moment the lights dimmed slightly, and a hush began to move through the crowd like a wave. The owner of Carter Global had arrived. Daniel's heart began to pound. This was it. 6 weeks of preparation, 2 years of desperation, his entire future walking through that door. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and fixed his most charming smile onto his face. And he turned toward the entrance with every other person in that room. The great doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and a woman walked in. She wore an elegant black gown that moved like water. She walked without hurry, without hesitation, with the absolute unshakable confidence of someone who had never once in her life wondered whether she belonged. The whole room went silent. Every eye followed her, and a murmur rippled through the crowd because no one had expected the invisible billionaire to be a woman, and no one had expected her to be so young, and no one at all could look away. Daniel Whitmore stared at her, and for the first 3 seconds he felt nothing but triumph. "She's beautiful," he thought. "This is easy. This is going to be so easy." And then she turned her head, and the light caught her face, and Daniel Whitmore's world stopped. He knew that face. He knew those eyes. For one horrible, endless moment, his brain refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The woman walking toward him across the ballroom in a gown worth more than his car, with senators and moguls parting before her like water, was the same woman he had thrown out of his building. The tired stranger, the plain coat, the risoled shoes, the nobody he had mocked in front of 40 employees, the woman he had told to learn her place. It couldn't be her, but it was. The champagne glass slipped in Daniel's hand. He caught it just before it fell, but the movement made him spill a few drops down his sleeve, and he stared down at the wetness on his cuff, and a memory hit him so hard it nearly buckled his knees. Coffee, down his jacket. That day, her face. "You'll remember me." Daniel's mouth went dry. His heart was slamming against his ribs so hard he could hear it. He looked around wildly, hoping anyone would tell him he was wrong, that he was seeing things that the exhaustion and the pressure had finally made him crack. But everyone else was staring at the woman with awe, with hunger, with the naked worship that powerful people reserve for someone even more powerful. And Daniel understood in a slow and sickening wave that he was the only person in the room who knew the truth. He had humiliated her. He had thrown her out. And now she owned his future. An older man in a perfectly cut suit stepped forward beside the woman. Richard Hayes. He raised his voice, and it carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, It is my great honor to introduce for the first time in public the sole owner of Carter Global Holdings, Miss Emily Carter." The room erupted. Applause thundered off the walls. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. People surged forward, all of them wanting to be the first to shake her hand, to be seen with her, to claim some tiny piece of her attention. But Emily didn't look at any of them. Emily looked at Daniel. Across that vast, crowded room, past the senators and the moguls and the flashing cameras, her eyes found his and held them. And there was nothing cruel in her gaze. That was what undid him. If she had glared at him, if she had smirked, if there had been even a flicker of triumph on her face, Daniel could have hated her, and hating her would have given him something to stand on. But there was no triumph. There was only that same quiet, patient look from the day in the lobby, the look of a person watching and waiting to see what he would do. Daniel felt every drop of blood drain from his face. He wanted to run. Every animal instinct in him screamed at him to turn and walk out of that ballroom and never come back. But he couldn't move. His legs had turned to stone. And so he stood there frozen, while the woman he had called worthless was swarmed by the most powerful people in America, and he understood with perfect, awful clarity that his entire life was about to be decided in the next few minutes, and that he had no control over any of it. Harold Voss appeared at his elbow, his face full of excited confusion. "Daniel," he whispered, Did you know it was a woman? My God, and so young. Have you met her? You have to introduce me." Daniel opened his mouth. No sound came out. "Daniel," Harold peered at him. "Son, you've gone white as a sheet. Are you all right?" "I have to," Daniel started. But he didn't finish because at that moment the crowd around Emily began to part, and she was walking toward him, slowly, calmly. Every step closing the distance between them and Daniel stood rooted to the floor and watched her come the way a man watches a wave he cannot outrun. She stopped in front of him. Up close, she was even harder to look at because up close, he could not pretend. This was her, the same woman, the same eyes that had looked at him with disappointment weeks ago. Except now she wore a gown from Paris, and 100 powerful people were watching, holding their breath, sensing that something was happening, that these two knew each other, that there was a story here they didn't understand. "Mr. Whitmore," Emily said. Her voice was calm and pleasant, and it carried just far enough for the people nearest them to hear. "Thank you for coming." Daniel tried to speak. His voice came out cracked and small. "Miss Carter, there must be some. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Is there?" Emily tilted her head slightly. And here it came, the moment Emily had planned for 6 weeks, the moment she had waited for. She could have exposed him right there in front of everyone, could have said, "This is the man who threw me out of his building, who mocked my clothes, who told me to learn my place." She could have destroyed him with a single sentence, and the crowd would have gasped, and Daniel Whitmore's reputation would have died in that ballroom, and every person there would have watched it happen. She did not. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, and she said in a voice pitched low enough that only he could hear, "Do you recognize me, Daniel?" His throat worked. He couldn't lie, not to her face, not with those eyes on him. "Yes," he whispered. "Say it," she said gently. Daniel closed his eyes. The whole room seemed to press in on him, all that wealth, all that power, all those watching faces, and in the middle of it, he had never felt so small, so exposed, so seen. "You're the woman," he breathed, "from my building, the one who spilled the coffee, the one I—" His voice failed. "The one you threw out," Emily finished quietly. "The one you said didn't belong in your world, the one you told to learn her place." She let the words settle. "That's the woman whose company you've been desperate to impress for 6 weeks. That's who's holding your future in her hands right now." She paused. "How does that feel, Daniel?" Daniel Whitmore, the man who measured everyone by their price tag, the man who had never once in his adult life felt shame, felt his eyes begin to sting. "I didn't know," he choked out. "I swear to God I didn't know who you were." And there it was, the moment, the thing Emily had come to hear. Because in those 5 words, Daniel had told her everything about himself, and it was the worst possible answer he could have given, and he didn't even realize it. Emily's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went cold and sad all at once. "That's the problem, Daniel," she said softly. "You said you didn't know who I was, as if the way you treat someone is supposed to depend on who they are, as if I would have deserved kindness only if you'd known I was rich." She shook her head slowly. "You didn't do anything wrong to a billionaire that day. You did something wrong to a human being, and the fact that you think those are different things is exactly the reason we're standing here." Daniel had no answer. There was no answer. She had reached into the center of him and named the rot she found there, and he knew, standing in that glittering ballroom in his $12,000 suit, that she was completely right. "Please," he whispered, "my company, everyone who works for me. If you pull out, they lose everything. 200 families. Please, punish me, I deserve it, but don't punish them for what I did." And Emily paused, because that right there was the first true thing Daniel Whitmore had said all night. That was the first time he had thought about someone other than himself. Not the deal, not his reputation, not his penthouse, the families, the 200 people who would lose their jobs. It was small, and it was late, and it was born out of desperation, but it was real, and Emily heard it, and it was the tiny crack in the armor her father had told her to look for. Maybe, she thought, maybe there's still someone in there after all. She stepped back. The crowd had grown restless, sensing drama they couldn't hear, and cameras were still flashing, and Richard was watching her with a face carved from stone. Emily raised her voice so the room could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, and instantly the ballroom fell silent again. "You came tonight to witness a historic investment, Carter Global Holdings and Whitmore Enterprises." A murmur of anticipation. "And I have made my decision." Daniel stopped breathing. This was it. His whole life, balanced on the words of a woman he had thrown out of his building. "Carter Global will invest in Whitmore Enterprises," Emily announced. The room broke into applause, and relief flooded through Daniel so violently that he nearly wept. He had done it. He was saved. Somehow, impossibly, she was going to save him anyway. "On 3 conditions," Emily continued, and the applause died instantly. The whole room leaned in. "The first condition," Emily said, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face, "is that every employee who has been wrongfully terminated in the last 2 years will be offered their job back with full back pay. The single mother who was fired when her son was in the hospital, the security guard who lost his pension 6 months before retirement, every one of them, they will be found and they will be made whole." Daniel's face went slack. She knew. She knew all of it. Names, details, stories he had forgotten the moment they happened. How could she possibly know? "The second condition," Emily went on, "is that Whitmore Enterprises will establish a new program funded and monitored by Carter Global, dedicated to the dignity, fair treatment, and advancement of every employee, from the executives down to the people who clean the floors at night. Because the people who clean the floors, Mr. Whitmore, are exactly as human as the people who sit in the corner offices. And it's long past time someone in that company acted like it." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some of the powerful people in that room shifted uncomfortably because they recognized themselves in what she was saying, and they didn't like it. "And the third condition," Emily said. She paused. This was the one, the heaviest one. Daniel braced himself, certain of what was coming, certain she was about to strip him of his company in front of everyone he knew. "The third condition," Emily said, "is that Daniel Whitmore will step down as chief executive of the company his uncle built." The gasp that went through the ballroom was audible. Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. There it was. She was taking it. Everything. His title, his power, his name, all of it gone in a single sentence in front of every important person in New York. He looked at her, and the shame and the fear and the loss all crashed over him at once, and for a moment he thought he might actually be sick right there on the ballroom floor. But Emily wasn't finished. "He will step down as CEO," she said, "and he will not receive a golden parachute. He will not walk away with millions. He will not be quietly rewarded for failure the way men like him usually are." She let that hang in the air. "Instead, Mr. Whitmore, if you choose to accept this, you will start over. You will work inside your own company from the bottom, in the very positions you have spent years looking down upon. And in 1 year, the people who work there, the ones you humiliated and dismissed and threw away, they will decide by their own vote whether you have earned the right to lead them again. The ballroom was utterly silent. No one had ever heard anything like it. This wasn't a punishment, and it wasn't a pardon. It was something stranger and harder than either. It was a test. Emily looked at Daniel, and for the first time she let a small measure of warmth into her voice, so quiet that only he could hear it. "I looked into you, Daniel," she said. "All of you, not just the cruelty. I found the rest of it too. I found a young man who volunteered at a veterans shelter every weekend for 2 years. I found a college kid who jumped into a freezing river to save a drowning child and never told a soul." She saw his eyes widen, saw the shock of being known, truly known, all the way down. That man is still in there somewhere. I believe that. I have to believe that, or none of this means anything. So this is my offer. Not a punishment, a door. You can walk through it and try to find your way back to the man who jumped into that river, or you can refuse and keep your pride and walk out of here with nothing and prove that man is gone for good. She stepped back. The choice is yours. It always was. Daniel Whitmore stood in the center of the most powerful room in America, stripped bare in front of everyone, offered a chance he had done nothing to deserve by a woman he had treated like garbage, and he did not know what to say. His whole life, everything he believed was breaking apart inside him, because Emily Carter had just proven in front of hundreds of witnesses that power was not the ability to crush people. She had every reason to crush him every right, and the crowd would have cheered. Instead, she had offered him something he would never in 1,000 years have offered anyone in her position: mercy. And Daniel, who had spent his entire life certain that mercy was weakness, felt the ground of his whole existence crack open beneath his feet. "Why?" he finally managed to whisper, and his voice broke on the word. "Why would you do this for me, after what I did?" Emily looked at him for a long moment. "Because someone did it for my father once," she said. "When he was a poor kid from a coal town with nothing but anger and pride, someone gave him a chance he didn't deserve, and that chance built everything you see in this room." She glanced around the glittering ballroom, then back at him. "Kindness is the only thing that ever really changes anyone, Daniel. Not fear, not punishment, not money. Kindness. My father taught me that. And tonight I'm choosing to believe he was right even about a man like you." The whole room was frozen waiting, and Richard Hayes stood off to the side with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and even he in that moment could not have told you what Daniel Whitmore would choose. Because the truth was, no one knew. Not Emily, not Richard, not Daniel himself. Daniel looked down at his $12,000 suit. He looked at his handmade shoes. He looked at the watch on his wrist, worth more than a year of a working man's wages. And then he looked up at the woman in front of him, the woman he had thrown out of his own building, who had walked back into his life, holding his entire future in her hands, and had chosen against all reason to hand him a second chance instead of a knife. And Daniel Whitmore, for the first time since he was a young man diving into a freezing river to save a stranger's child, felt something crack open in his chest that he had sealed shut a very long time ago. He opened his mouth to answer, and every person in that ballroom held their breath to hear what he would say. "I accept." 2 words. Daniel Whitmore said them in a voice barely louder than a whisper, but in that silent ballroom they landed like a hammer. "I accept your terms. All of them. Everyone." A murmur swept through the crowd. Some of the powerful people in that room looked disappointed because they had come hoping to watch a man be destroyed, and destruction is a spectacle people never tire of. But Daniel wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Emily, and he said in a voice that shook, "You're right, about all of it. I don't deserve this chance, but I'll take it, and I'll spend every day trying to be worth it." Emily studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lie, for the angle, for the calculation that men like Daniel always had. She didn't find it, not yet, but she didn't trust it either. "We'll see us," was all she said. And that was how the most powerful men in New York watched Daniel Whitmore give away his own kingdom without a fight. Richard Hayes stepped forward with the paperwork, and Daniel signed it right there on a small table beneath the chandeliers, his hand trembling so badly he could barely hold the pen. When he finished, he set the pen down, and he looked up, and for one moment, he and Emily simply looked at each other across the table. Two people bound now by a promise neither of them was certain the other could keep. "Come to my office Monday morning," Emily said. 9 o'clock. Richard will give you the details. And Daniel. She paused. "Don't wear the suit." The next morning, Daniel Whitmore woke up in his penthouse, and for the first few seconds before memory returned, he felt fine. Then it all came crashing back, and he lay very still in his enormous bed and stared at the ceiling and felt the full weight of what had happened settle onto his chest. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He got up. He walked through the penthouse that suddenly felt too big and too empty, and the phone started ringing. The first call was from Harold Voss, the real estate legend who had clapped him on the shoulder just 12 hours earlier. "Daniel," Harold said, and his voice was different now, cooler, careful. "Heard about last night. Rough business. Listen, that dinner we had scheduled for next week, I'm going to have to push it. Things are busy. I'll have my girl call your girl." And he hung up before Daniel could answer, and Daniel stood there holding the phone, understanding exactly what had just happened. Harold Voss did not push dinners. Harold Voss did not have things to be busy with. Harold Voss had simply smelled the change in the wind, and Harold Voss was walking away. The second call was the same, and the third. All morning the phone rang, and one by one the people who had fought to shake his hand at the party remembered urgent reasons they could no longer make time for Daniel Whitmore. Business partners who had called him a genius last month suddenly weren't returning messages. A woman he had been seeing, the daughter of a shipping magnate, sent a single cold text saying she thought they should slow things down and then stopped answering entirely. By noon, Daniel understood something that hit him harder than losing the company. None of them had ever been his friends. Not one. In 2 years of parties and dinners and handshakes and champagne, in 2 years of being one of the most sought-after men in New York, Daniel Whitmore had not made a single friend. He had made contacts. He had made connections. He had made 100 people who wanted something from him and would vanish the instant he had nothing left to give. And now that he had nothing, they were vanishing exactly on schedule, and the speed of it was breathtaking. He sat down on his expensive couch in his expensive penthouse, and he put his head in his hands, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Whitmore felt completely and utterly alone. And into that silence came a voice from his memory, quiet and steady. "You'll go to your grave surrounded by people who wanted your money and never once know real friendship." He hadn't heard Emily say those exact words, but he could imagine them, and they were true. God help him, they were true. Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Daniel Whitmore walked into the offices of Carter Global Holdings. He did not wear the suit. He had thought about it for a long time, standing in his closet staring at rows of tailored jackets worth more than most people's cars. And finally, he had put on a plain gray sweater and simple slacks, and he had looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Without the armor, he looked younger and more afraid. Richard Hayes was waiting for him in the lobby. The old man looked him up and down, taking in the plain clothes, and something flickered across his face that might have been the smallest possible measure of approval, though he was careful not to let it show. "Mr. Whitmore," Richard said, "this way." He led Daniel not to a grand office, but to a small conference room, and there waiting for him was Emily Carter. She wore a simple dark suit, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who ran an empire and had nothing left to prove to anyone. She gestured to a chair, and Daniel sat. "I'll be honest with you," Emily said without any preamble. "Richard thinks I'm making a mistake. He thinks you'll fail. Half the people in that ballroom Saturday night think I've gone soft, and there's a real chance they're all right." She folded her hands. "So let me tell you exactly what this is going to be so you don't have any illusions. This is not a demotion, Daniel. This is a reset. Starting today, you are going to go work inside Whitmore Enterprises, and you are going to start where the people you looked down on start. You're going to do their jobs. You're going to live their days. You're going to find out what it actually feels like to be one of the people you spent years treating like they were invisible." Daniel swallowed. "For how long?" "Until you understand," Emily said. "And I'll know when you do. Or I won't, and you'll fail, and this will all have been a waste. But that's the deal. You want your name back? You want your place in the world back. Then you earn it one day at a time from the bottom. She stood. You start tomorrow. 6 a.m. loading dock. Report to a man named Frank. Daniel's mouth went dry. The loading dock. The loading dock, Emily confirmed. The place where your company receives its shipments. The place I'd be willing to bet you've never once set foot in the entire time you ran the company. She looked at him steadily. Am I wrong? He wasn't wrong. Daniel had never been to the loading dock in his life. He hadn't even been entirely sure the company had one. No, he admitted quietly. You're not wrong. The next morning at 10 minutes to 6, Daniel Whitmore stood outside the loading dock of the company he used to own in a pair of work boots he'd had to buy the night before because he didn't own a single practical thing, and he felt sick with dread. A heavy-set man in his 50s came out to meet him. Frank. Frank had worked the loading dock at Whitmore Enterprises for 18 years. Frank had a bad knee and a good heart and absolutely no patience for nonsense. He looked at Daniel, and there was no way he didn't recognize him because everyone in the building knew the face of the man who used to run the place. But Frank didn't say a word about it. You the new guy? Frank asked. Yes, sir, Daniel said. Frank raised an eyebrow at the sir. You ever work a dock before? No, sir. You ever do a real day of physical work in your life? Daniel hesitated. No, sir, I don't think I have. Frank sighed the sigh of a man who has seen everything and expects the worst. All right, well, we'll find out what you're made of. Trucks start rolling in at 6. We unload them, we sort the freight, we stage it for distribution. It's heavy, it's fast, and if you're slow, you hold up the whole line and everybody's day goes to hell. So keep up or get out of the way. Understand? Yes, sir. And so it began. That first morning nearly killed him. The boxes were heavier than Daniel had imagined anything could be. Within an hour, his arms were shaking, and his back was screaming, and his hands, soft hands that had never done anything harder than sign checks, were raw and blistered. The other men on the dock worked with a speed and rhythm that seemed impossible, hoisting and sorting and stacking, calling out to each other, moving like a machine, while Daniel stumbled and dropped things and fell further and further behind. By 9 o'clock, he was so exhausted he could barely stand. He leaned against a stack of pallets, gasping, his whole body trembling, and one of the younger workers, a kid named Tyler, maybe 22 years old, walked past and muttered under his breath, "Rich boy's not going to last the week." And here is the thing that would have happened 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel Whitmore would have had that kid fired on the spot for the disrespect. He would have felt the old rage rise up, that hot need to crush anyone who made him feel small. But something was different now, because Daniel was too tired to be proud. And in his exhaustion, stripped of his suit and his title and his money and his certainty, something got through to him that never could have gotten through before. He looked at Tyler, at this 22-year-old kid who did this every single day, who unloaded these impossible boxes for hours and made it look easy. And instead of anger, Daniel felt something he had never once felt for a working man in his entire life. He felt respect. You're right, Daniel said. I probably won't. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. How do you do this every day? Tyler stopped, surprised. He'd expected an argument or worse. He hadn't expected honesty. He looked at Daniel for a second, reassessing. You get used to it, he finally said. Your body toughens up. First couple weeks are the worst. He paused, then added almost against his will. You want a tip? Stop lifting with your back. You're going to throw it out. Bend your knees, keep the box close to your body, let your legs do the work, like this. And he demonstrated, and Daniel watched, and Daniel copied him, and the box that had felt impossible a moment ago suddenly felt almost manageable. Thank you, Daniel said. And he meant it in a way he had never meant those 2 words in his life. Tyler shrugged, but something in his face had shifted. Don't mention it, rich boy. But he said rich boy differently that time, not as an insult, almost as a joke. Almost, though, not quite as something a friend might say. The days that followed were a slow, brutal, humbling education. And Daniel learned things on that loading dock that no business school could have ever taught him. He learned that Frank, the gruff old foreman, had a daughter in nursing school he was ferociously proud of, and that he worked double shifts to pay for it, and that he hadn't taken a real vacation in 11 years. He learned that Tyler was supporting his mother and two younger siblings because their father had walked out, and that this dock job, the job Daniel would once have called beneath him, was the thing keeping that entire family off the street. He learned their names, he learned their stories, and slowly, painfully, he began to learn something about himself, which was that for 2 years he had walked past hundreds of people exactly like Frank and Tyler, and he had never once seen them as human beings. They had been furniture to him. Background. And the shame of that, once it took root, grew in Daniel Whitmore like a slow fire. After 2 weeks on the dock, Emily moved him. She had him transferred to the night cleaning crew. And if the loading dock had humbled Daniel's body, the cleaning crew humbled his soul. Because on the cleaning crew, Daniel became truly invisible. He worked from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, mopping the floors of the very offices he used to rule, emptying the trash cans of executives who used to fear him, scrubbing the toilets in the building that used to bear his name. And the people who saw him, the few late working employees who passed him in the halls, looked right through him exactly the way he used to look right through people. And Daniel finally understood in his bones what that felt like. It felt like not existing. One night around 3 in the morning, Daniel was cleaning the executive floor, the 40th floor, the floor where it had all begun. He was pushing his cart down the hall when he came to the exact spot where he had thrown Emily out, the exact place where the coffee had spilled, where he had laughed, where he had told a tired stranger she didn't belong in his world. Daniel stopped his cart. And standing there at 3 in the morning alone, in a janitor's uniform in the place where his cruelty had set his whole downfall in motion, Daniel Whitmore did something he had not done since he was a small child. He wept. He stood in that empty hallway and he cried for all of it. For the man he had become, for the people he had hurt, for the years he had wasted, for the boy he used to be, who had somewhere along the way gotten lost. He cried for Frank's bad knee, and Tyler's absent father, and the single mother he had fired when her son was sick. He cried because he finally truly understood what he had done, not to a billionaire, but to 100 human beings who had never done anything to deserve his contempt. And when he was done crying, something in Daniel Whitmore was different, lighter, as if the crying had washed something poisonous out of him. He picked up his mop, and he cleaned that hallway until it shone. And he did it not because anyone was watching, not because it would earn him anything, but because the people who worked on that floor deserved to come into a clean office, and because doing a job well, any job was a thing worth doing. Nobody saw it. Nobody knew. Except that somebody did. Because Emily Carter had cameras in that building, and Emily Carter had been watching Daniel Whitmore every single day since he'd started. And Emily Carter had seen the whole thing, the stopping of the cart, the recognition of the place, the tears, and the mopping afterward, the careful, thorough cleaning of a floor no one would ever thank him for. She watched it alone late at night in her office, and when it was over, she sat very still for a long time. Richard came in and found her there. He looked at the frozen image on her screen, Daniel Whitmore in a janitor's uniform, and he understood what he was seeing. "He's crying," Richard observed. "Yes," Emily said. Richard was quiet for a moment. "Men cry when they get caught," he said carefully. "It doesn't always mean they've changed. It sometimes just means they're sorry they got caught." "I know," Emily said. "So how do you know the difference?" Emily gestured at the screen at the image of Daniel mopping the empty hallway. Because he didn't know anyone was watching Richard. He thought he was completely alone. There was nothing to gain, no one to impress, no angle to play. And he cleaned the floor anyway. He cried, and then he did the work, and then he went home. She looked up at the old man. "That's the difference. What a man does when he thinks nobody's watching. My father taught me that too." Richard studied the screen for a long moment. And then slowly the old advisor, who had been so certain that Daniel Whitmore was beyond saving, felt something in his hard heart shift, just slightly. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. But not everyone was ready to believe, because word had gotten around Whitmore Enterprises about what was happening. The employees knew that their former CEO, the man who had humiliated so many of them, was now working in the building at the very bottom. And the reactions were not kind, and Emily had known they wouldn't be, and this too was part of the test. because the second half of Emily's condition, the part that mattered most, was that in 1 year, the employees themselves would vote on whether Daniel had earned the right to lead them again. And right now, if that vote had been held, Daniel Whitmore would have lost in a landslide. There was a woman named Sandra who worked in accounting. Sandra was 53 years old, and 2 years earlier, Daniel Whitmore had made her cry in front of the entire finance department over a mistake that had turned out to be his own, and he had never apologized, and Sandra had never forgotten it. And when Sandra heard that Daniel was now cleaning floors in the building, she did not feel pity. She felt something closer to grim satisfaction, and she was not proud of that, but it was the truth. One evening, Sandra was working late, and she came around a corner and nearly walked straight into Daniel, who was on his knees scrubbing a coffee stain out of the carpet by the break room. They both froze. Sandra looked down at the man who had humiliated her, and Daniel looked up at the woman he had made cry, and he remembered her. He remembered exactly what he had done, and the shame hit him so hard he could barely breathe. "Sandra," he said quietly. She was surprised he knew her name. He hadn't known it 2 years ago. He'd called her you when he'd screamed at her in front of everyone. "Mr. Whitmore," she said stiffly. "Not anymore," Daniel said. "Just Daniel now." He got to his feet slowly, his knees aching, and then he did something that he would have found unthinkable a month before. He looked her in the eye and he said, "Sandra, I owe you an apology. 2 years ago, I humiliated you in front of the whole department over an error that was mine, not yours. I was cruel to you, and I was wrong, and I never gave you the apology you deserved. I'm giving it to you now. I'm sorry, truly. For what it's worth, and I know it may not be worth much, I'm sorry." Sandra stared at him. She had waited 2 years for those words. She had rehearsed in her angriest moments exactly what she would say to Daniel Whitmore if she ever got the chance. She had a whole speech prepared. And now here he was on his knees with a scrub brush, saying the words she'd never thought she'd hear, and to her own surprise she found that all her rehearsed anger had nowhere to go. But she was not ready to forgive him, not yet. 2 years of resentment does not dissolve in a single moment, and Emily had never expected it to. "You made me cry in front of everyone I work with," Sandra said, and her voice shook. "Do you have any idea what that did to me? I'm 53 years old. I have grandchildren. And you made me feel like I was nothing, like I was garbage, in front of every single person I see every day." "I know," Daniel said. "I know I did." "An apology doesn't fix that." "No," Daniel agreed. "It doesn't. I'm not asking it to. I just needed you to know that I see it now. What I did. I couldn't see it before. I don't expect anything from you. I don't deserve anything from you. I just wanted to say it." And he bent back down and he picked up his scrub brush and he went back to work on the coffee stain and he didn't say another word. Sandra stood there for a moment watching him, and then she walked away, and her heart was a confused knot of anger and shock and something she couldn't quite name. But that night, for the first time in 2 years, when Sandra thought about Daniel Whitmore, the anger didn't burn quite as hot. And that too Emily saw. Not the details, not the words. But she saw Sandra's face change over the following weeks. She saw the frost begin very slowly to thaw, and Emily understood that something was happening inside her company that no amount of money could have ever bought. A man was changing, and the people he had hurt were one by one beginning to see it. But Emily also knew the test was far from over, because there was one story she had not yet told Daniel, one name in the file she had built on him that she had deliberately kept back. The single mother who had been fired when her son was in the hospital. Her name was Maria Delgado, and her story was the worst of all of them, and Emily had a reason for holding it back, a reason that would test Daniel Whitmore harder than the loading dock and the cleaning crew and all the rest of it combined, because Maria Delgado's son had not gotten better. And the thing that had happened to Maria, the thing that Daniel did not yet know, was going to force him to face the single cruelest act of his entire time as CEO, and to reckon with a consequence he could never undo, and to discover once and for all whether the man Emily had gambled everything on was truly capable of becoming someone new. 3 weeks later, Emily called Daniel back to her office. He came in his work clothes, his hands calloused, now his frame leaner, his eyes different. He looked, Emily thought, like a man who had been sanded down to something truer. He sat across from her, and he waited, and Emily slid a single file folder across the desk toward him. "There's a name in here," she said quietly. "I haven't told you about yet, and I need you to read it. And then I need you to decide what kind of man you're going to be." Daniel looked at the folder. Something in Emily's voice frightened him. He opened it, and as he read the name, Maria Delgado, and the words that followed, the color drained from Daniel Whitmore's face, and his hands began to tremble, and he looked up at Emily with an expression of pure horror. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, God, what did I do?" The words on the page were simple, and that was what made them so unbearable. Maria Delgado, 31 years old, employed in the billing department for 4 years. Excellent performance reviews. Terminated on a Tuesday in March for excessive absences. And beneath that, in the plain, merciless language of a case file, the reason for those absences. Her 7-year-old son, Mateo, had been diagnosed with leukemia. She had missed work to sit beside his hospital bed. And on the day she was fired, she had been 3 days into a hospital stay where doctors were trying to stabilize the boy after a bad reaction to chemotherapy. Daniel remembered it now. That was the horror of it. He remembered. He had been in a bad mood that morning. The quarterly numbers had been ugly, and he'd been looking for costs to cut, and someone in HR had flagged an employee with too many absences, and Daniel hadn't even read the details. He hadn't cared about the details. He'd just seen a name and a number and said the word terminate, the way you'd swat a fly, and he'd moved on to lunch, and he had never thought about it again. He had ended a woman's livelihood while her child was fighting for his life without so much as reading her name. "There's more," Emily said quietly. "Keep reading." Daniel's hand shook as he turned the page, and what he read next stopped his heart. When Maria lost her job, she lost the health insurance that came with it. Her son's treatment, the treatment keeping him alive, was tied to that insurance. She had scrambled. She had applied for emergency coverage for assistance for anything. There had been a gap. A terrible, dangerous gap of several weeks where Mateo's care was interrupted, where a scheduled round of treatment was delayed because there was no way to pay for it. And Daniel understood with a wave of nausea that nearly doubled him over that his decision, the flick of his hand, the word he'd said without reading, had not just cost a woman her job. It had put a sick child's life in danger. "Is he—" Daniel could barely form the words. "The boy, Mateo, is he—" "He's alive!" Emily said, and Daniel let out a shuddering breath. "He's alive, Daniel. He's in remission now. He made it. But not because of anything that happened here. He made it because Maria fought for him with everything she had, and because a community health clinic took him in when she had nothing, and because that little boy turned out to be a fighter." Emily leaned forward. "But there were weeks, Daniel. Weeks where his mother sat in a waiting room not knowing if her son was going to get the treatment he needed. Weeks where she blamed herself. Weeks where she wondered if the delay was going to cost her everything." Emily's voice was quiet and hard. "You caused those weeks. You. With one word, you didn't even bother to read." Daniel put the file down. He couldn't hold it anymore. His hands were shaking too badly, and he sat there in Emily Carter's office, and he felt the full crushing weight of what he had done land on him all at once, and it was more than he could bear. "I didn't know," he whispered. And then he stopped himself because he heard the words come out of his mouth, and he remembered what Emily had said to him in the ballroom, that the way you treat someone should never depend on who they are. And he understood now that "I didn't know" was not an excuse. It was the crime itself. He hadn't known because he hadn't cared to know. He hadn't read the file because the woman in it hadn't mattered to him. His ignorance wasn't innocence. It was the very heart of his cruelty. "Don't," Emily said, watching his face. "Don't say you didn't know. You're finally starting to understand why." "Yes," Daniel said hoarsely. "I understand. God forgive me, I understand." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily said, "I've been trying to decide for weeks whether to show you this file, because I need you to understand something, Daniel. Some things can be repaired. The men on the loading dock, you can earn their respect. Sandra, maybe in time you can earn her forgiveness. But this—" She tapped the file. "This can't be undone. You can't give Maria back those weeks. You can't unmake the fear she lived through. You can't reach into the past and read the file you didn't read." Emily's eyes were steady on him. "So this isn't a test you can pass by fixing things. This is a test of what you do when you're standing in front of something you broke that can never be put back together. That's the hardest thing a person ever faces. And it's the truest measure of who they are. Daniel wiped his face with the back of his calloused hand. "What do I do?" he asked. And it was not a rhetorical question. He was genuinely asking, because the old Daniel would have known exactly what to do, would have thrown money at the problem, would have had lawyers draft a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement and made the whole thing disappear. But that Daniel was dying inside him, and the new one, the one who had wept in an empty hallway at 3 a.m, honestly did not know. "I can't tell you that," Emily said. "If I tell you what to do, then it's my choice, not yours. And the whole point is to find out what you choose." She stood. "Maria Delgado works here again. She was one of the first people I brought back with full back pay the day after our meeting. She's downstairs right now in the billing department, 3 floors below us." She walked to the door. "What you do with that information is up to you." And she left him there, alone, with the file, and a choice. Daniel Whitmore sat in that office for a long time. Every instinct he had built over a lifetime told him to run from this, to avoid Maria Delgado for the rest of his life, to never have to look into the eyes of a woman whose child he had endangered. That would be the easy thing, the safe thing. He could serve out his year, keep his head down, avoid the billing department, and never once face her. But he thought about the boy who had jumped into the freezing river. Emily had told him about that boy in the ballroom. Daniel had forgotten him. He'd been 20 years old walking across a bridge in the dead of winter, and he'd seen a child fall through the ice on the river below, and he had not thought, he had not calculated, he had not weighed the risk. He had simply climbed over the railing and jumped into water so cold it stopped his heart for a second, and he had grabbed that child and dragged him to shore, and he had nearly died doing it, and he had walked away before anyone could even thank him. Where had that boy gone? Somewhere, Daniel knew between the river and the corner office that boy had gotten scared, had learned that the world was cruel and that money was the only shield against it, had built walls and put on armor and traded his soul for a penthouse. But that boy had jumped. That boy had run toward the hard thing, not away from it. And Daniel Whitmore, 40 floors up in a borrowed office, made a decision. He took the elevator down 3 floors. The billing department was a room full of cubicles and quiet keyboard clatter, and Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, his heart pounding harder than it had on his first morning at the loading dock. He scanned the room, and then he saw her. A woman at a desk near the window, dark hair pulled back, focused on her screen, a small photograph of a smiling boy taped to the edge of her monitor. Mateo. Daniel's throat closed. He almost turned around. He almost lost his nerve. But he made himself walk across that room past the curious glances of the other employees who recognized him and wondered what the former CEO in janitor's clothes was doing on their floor, and he stopped in front of Maria Delgado's desk. She looked up, and when she saw who it was, her face went pale and then hard. Because Maria knew exactly who Daniel Whitmore was. She had spent the worst weeks of her life partly because of this man. She had gotten her job back, and the back pay had helped her family climb out of the hole, but she had not forgotten, and she had never expected an apology, and the sight of him standing at her desk filled her with a cold, wary anger. "Can I help you?" she said, and her voice was ice. Daniel opened his mouth, and for a second nothing came out. Because there were no words. There were genuinely no words adequate to what he needed to say. Everything he thought of sounded hollow, sounded like an excuse, sounded like a man trying to make himself feel better. So he didn't try to make it pretty. "Ms. Delgado," he said, and his voice broke on her name. "My name is Daniel Whitmore. 2 years ago, I fired you. I signed the order to terminate your employment while your son was in the hospital fighting for his life. I did it without reading your file. I did it without knowing your name or your son's name or anything about what you were going through. I did it because I was in a bad mood and looking for costs to cut, and you were a number on a page to me." He forced himself to keep his eyes on hers, though every part of him wanted to look away. "I found out this morning that when I fired you, you lost your insurance, that your son's treatment was interrupted, that there were weeks where you didn't know if he was going to get the care he needed, because of me, because of what I did." Maria had gone very still. "I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness," Daniel said. "I don't have any right to it, and I won't insult you by asking. I'm here because you deserve to hear from my own mouth that I know what I did to you. I know I put your child's life at risk. I know I can never take that back. And I know that no apology on earth can undo those weeks you lived through." His voice was shaking now, and he didn't try to hide it. "I just needed you to know that I see it. That you were never a number. That you were a mother fighting for her son, and I stepped on you without even looking down. And I am more sorry than I have words to say." The billing department had gone silent. Everyone was watching now. And Maria Delgado sat at her desk, staring up at the man who had nearly cost her everything, and her eyes filled with tears and her hands were trembling in her lap. For a long moment she couldn't speak, and then she did, and her voice was low and fierce and full of 2 years of pain. "Do you know what it's like," she said, "to sit in a hospital chapel at 2 a.m. and beg God to save your baby, and to know that the reason his treatment got delayed is because some rich man you never met decided you weren't worth the trouble of reading a file?" Tears were running down her face now. "Do you know what it's like to look at your son, your 7-year-old son so sick he can't lift his head, and to think this might be the delay that kills him, and it's because I lost my job and I lost my job for taking care of him?" "No," Daniel said, and he was crying too now openly in front of everyone, this man who had once believed tears were weakness. "No, I don't know what that's like, and I never had to know because I had money, and money meant I never had to face a single consequence in my entire life. Until now." Maria looked at him. And here is where the story could have gone 100 different ways. Maria Delgado owed Daniel Whitmore nothing. Not forgiveness, not grace, not a single kind word. She had every right in the world to tell him to get out of her sight and never come near her again, and no one, not Emily, not anyone would have blamed her for it. Forgiveness is not owed. It can never be demanded. It is only ever a gift freely given, and often it is given to people who don't deserve it, which is the only thing that makes it forgiveness at all. Maria was quiet for a long time. She looked at the photo of Mateo taped to her monitor, her smiling, living, breathing son, in remission, alive. She looked at that photo, and then she looked at the broken man standing in front of her desk, and something in her, something bigger than her anger, made a choice. "My son is alive," she said quietly. "He's alive, Mr. Whitmore. He beat it. He's back in school. He plays soccer now. He's the toughest kid I've ever known." Her voice caught. "For 2 years I've carried this anger at you around like a stone in my chest, and it's heavy. I'm tired of carrying it. It hasn't hurt you. It's only ever hurt me." She wiped her eyes. "I don't know if I forgive you. I don't think forgiveness is a thing you decide all at once. But I'm going to try. Not for you, for me, and for my son. Because I don't want to raise him to be a person who carries stones." Daniel could barely stand. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." "Yeah," Maria said. And incredibly through her tears, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "It is." And then she said something that broke Daniel Whitmore wide open. "You should meet him someday," she said. "Mateo, when you're ready, when you've really become whoever it is you're trying to become. He should meet the man who did a terrible thing and then had the courage to stand in front of the person he hurt and own it. Because that's a lesson, too, that people can be more than the worst thing they ever did. I want my son to believe that. I have to believe that, or the world's too dark to live in." Daniel Whitmore walked out of the billing department that day, a different man than the one who had walked in. And upstairs in her office, Emily Carter watched it all on the monitor. And she was crying too quietly alone, because she had gambled everything on the belief that a cruel man could become a good one. And for the first time, she truly believed she had been right. Richard stood beside her, and even the old advisor who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing for 40 years had to clear his throat and look away. "Well," Richard said gruffly, "I'll be damned. Twice in 1 month." The months that followed changed everything. Word of what Daniel had done spread through Whitmore Enterprises faster than any memo ever could. Not the corporate version, not a press release, but the real version, passed from cubicle to cubicle, from the loading dock to the executive floor. The story of the former CEO who had stood in the billing department and wept and apologized to a woman he had wronged. And something began to shift inside that company, something that no policy could have created. The employees began to see Daniel differently. Not all at once, not everyone. There were still people who hated him, and they had every right to, and Daniel never once asked them to feel otherwise. But the ice was breaking. Frank on the loading dock started saving him a coffee in the mornings. Tyler taught him how to drive the forklift and stopped calling him Rich Boy and started calling him Danny. Sandra from accounting, the woman he had made cry, stopped by one afternoon while he was mopping and simply said, "I heard what you did, for the Delgado woman." And then, after a long pause, "It was the right thing." And she walked away, and that was all, but for Sandra it was everything, and Daniel understood that. He kept working. Every job Emily gave him, he did it fully, and he did it well. He unloaded trucks, he cleaned floors, he answered phones in customer service and got yelled at by angry customers and learned to keep his temper. He worked in the mailroom, he shadowed the maintenance crew, and in every single department, he did the thing he had never once done as CEO. He learned people's names, he asked about their lives, he listened, and the more he listened, the more he understood how the company actually worked. Not the way it looked on a spreadsheet, but the way it really worked from the ground up, held together by hundreds of ordinary people doing their jobs, people he had never seen when he sat in his corner office counting money. One evening, about 6 months in, Emily called Daniel to her office again. He came in his work clothes as he always did now. He'd stopped owning the fancy suits. He'd sold the penthouse quietly and moved into a normal apartment and given a large portion of the money to a foundation for families with children in cancer treatment. And he had done it without a single press release, without telling anyone, because he had finally learned that the good you do in secret is the only good that truly counts. Emily gestured for him to sit. "I've been watching you," she said, "for 6 months, every day." Daniel nodded. He'd assumed as much. "When I made you that offer in the ballroom," Emily said, "Richard thought I was a fool. He thought you'd take the deal, do the bare minimum, play the part for a year, and go right back to being who you were the second you got your title back. He thought you were a lost cause." She paused. "I have to be honest with you, Daniel. Part of me thought so too. I hoped I was wrong, but I wasn't sure." "And now?" Daniel asked quietly. Emily was silent for a moment. "There's something I never told you," she said, "about why I was in your building that day, why I was dressed the way I was." And she told him. She told him about the 3 years she had spent living as an ordinary woman, about the false name, about the secondhand clothes, about her quiet experiment to find out whether anyone would treat her with dignity when she had nothing to offer them. She told him about her father, the poor boy from the coal town, and the lesson he had taught her, that you can know a man's entire soul by watching how he treats a waiter or a stranger or anyone who can do nothing for him at all. "That day in your lobby," Emily said, "you failed that test worse than almost anyone I ever met. You looked at a tired woman in old shoes, and you saw something less than human." She held his eyes. "But here's what I've learned in 6 months of watching you, Daniel. A person is not the worst thing they ever did. A person is what they do next. And what you've done next has been the hardest, humblest, most honest work I've ever watched anyone do." Her voice softened. "You didn't just change your behavior. You changed. I've seen it. In the way you talked to Frank. In the way you knelt down in front of Maria Delgado and let her see you cry. In the money you gave away that you thought no one knew about." Daniel's head came up. "You knew about that. I know about everything," Emily said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, she smiled. "It's my company. Of course I know." Daniel looked down at his calloused hands. "I didn't do any of it to earn anything," he said. "I want you to know that. Somewhere along the way, I stopped doing it for the year or the title or the vote. I started doing it because it was right, because those people deserved it, because I finally understood I'd spent my whole life being a coward, dressed up as a strong man." He looked up. "If you told me right now that I could never have the company back, that I'd clean floors for the rest of my life, I'd be all right with that. I mean it. This is the first time in years I've been able to look at myself in the mirror." And that, Emily thought, was the answer. That right there. Because the old Daniel would have said whatever it took to get the title back. The new Daniel had just told her honestly that he no longer needed it, and a man who no longer needs power for his ego is exactly the kind of man who can finally be trusted with it. Emily leaned back in her chair. "The vote is in 6 months," she said. "The employees will decide whether you lead them again, and I want to be clear with you, Daniel. I'm not going to influence it. I'm not going to put my thumb on the scale. It's their choice completely. You hurt them. They get to decide if you've earned your way back." She paused. "But I'll tell you this. 6 months ago, if that vote had been held, you'd have lost every single ballot." A small smile. "It might not go that way anymore." Daniel felt something rise in his chest, something warm and painful and hopeful all at once. "There's one more thing," Emily said, and her expression grew serious again. "Something that's going to test you one final time. And I need you to hear it, because it's the hardest part of all of this, and I won't pretend otherwise." Daniel braced himself. "There's someone who's been trying to reach you," Emily said, "for weeks now. Someone from your past. Someone who knew you before all of this, before the company, before you became the man you became." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. "A name, a phone number. He says he knew you a long time ago. He says his name is David Chen. And he says—" Emily paused, and something in her face told Daniel that whatever came next was going to change everything. "He says he's the child you pulled out of the river." Daniel Whitmore stared at the name on the paper, and the whole room seemed to tilt around him. "That's not possible," he whispered. "He's 26 years old now," Emily said quietly. "He's a Dr. Daniel, a pediatric oncologist. He treats children with cancer. He spent his whole life saving kids because when he was 6 years old, a stranger jumped into a frozen river and saved him and never even stayed long enough to give his name." Emily's eyes were shining. "He's been looking for you for 20 years. And a few weeks ago, he saw the story about the CEO who gave up his company, and he saw your name, and he saw your photograph, and he recognized the man who pulled him out of the water. He recognized the face he's carried in his memory his entire life." Daniel couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He looked at the name on the paper, David Chen, and 20 years collapsed into a single instant, and the boy he had forgotten, the boy from the river, the last piece of the man he used to be, was suddenly impossibly real and alive, and reaching out to him across 2 decades. "He wants to meet you," Emily said softly. "The man who saved his life. He wants to say thank you." She paused. "The question is, are you ready to meet him? Are you ready to stand in front of the living proof of the good man you used to be and find out whether you've finally become him again?" And Daniel Whitmore held that piece of paper in his trembling, calloused hands, and he wept for the 3rd time in his new life. But this time the tears were something entirely different. This time they were tears of a man who had finally found his way home. It took Daniel 3 days to work up the courage to make the call. He held that piece of paper in his hands for 3 days, reading and rereading the name David Chen, and every time he picked up his phone, his heart hammered so hard he had to put it back down. Because meeting Maria Delgado had meant facing the worst thing he had ever done. But meeting David Chen meant something even harder. It meant facing the best thing he had ever done, the last proof of the good man he used to be, and discovering whether he was still worthy of it. On the 3rd night alone in his small apartment, Daniel finally dialed the number. It rang twice. And then a voice answered, a warm, steady grown man's voice. "This is David." Daniel opened his mouth, and for a second, nothing came out. And then he said in a voice that shook, "My name is Daniel Whitmore. I was told you've been trying to reach me." There was a silence on the other end of the line, a long one. And then David Chen said very quietly, "Is it really you? Are you the man from the bridge? The one who pulled me out of the river?" Daniel's throat closed. "I think so. 20 years ago, in the winter, there was a boy who fell through the ice." "That was me," David said, and his voice was thick now. "That was me. I was 6 years old. I've been looking for you my whole life." A shaky breath. "Mr. Whitmore, I became a doctor because of you. Everything I am, everything I've done, all of it, traces back to a stranger who jumped into a frozen river and then disappeared before I could even see his face." A pause. "Can I meet you, please? There's so much I need to say." They agreed to meet at a small diner the next evening. A plain, ordinary place, the kind of place the old Daniel would never have set foot in, the kind of place the new Daniel now preferred. Daniel got there early. He sat in a booth by the window, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling, and he thought that if the bell over the door didn't ring soon, he might lose his nerve entirely. And then it rang, and a young man walked in. 26 years old, tall and kind-faced, in a doctor's white coat. He hadn't had time to take off, and the two of them looked at each other across the diner, and they both knew. David Chen crossed the room, and he stood in front of Daniel's booth, and for a moment, neither of them could speak. Then David said, "You saved my life. Daniel started. But David wasn't finished. "You saved my life, and you never asked for anything. Not a thank you, not a reward, not even your name in the paper. You just did it and you walked away, and I spent 20 years wondering who you were and whether I'd ever get to tell you what you gave me." His eyes filled. "I have a wife, Mr. Whitmore. I have a little girl. She's 3. Her name is Grace, and none of them would exist if you hadn't jumped into that water. Do you understand? There's a whole family alive today, and there are hundreds of children I've treated kids who are alive right now, playing outside growing up, because a stranger saved a drowning boy and gave him a life to live." He was crying now openly. "You didn't just save me. You saved everyone I've ever helped. That's what you did. That's who you are." And Daniel Whitmore, who had spent years believing he was important because of his money and his title and his penthouse, sat in a plain diner booth and learned for the first time what actually made a life important. "You have it wrong," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "You have it so wrong. I'm not David you need to know who I've been. I'm not the man you've been carrying in your memory. That boy who jumped into the river, I lost him. Somewhere along the way, I became a cruel, selfish man who measured people by their bank accounts. I hurt people. I fired a woman whose child had cancer, and I didn't even read her name. I threw a stranger out of my building for being poor. The man you've been looking for your whole life, the hero he stopped existing a long time ago." Daniel looked down at his calloused hands. "I've spent the last year trying to become him again, and I don't know if I've made it. That's the truth. I don't know if I deserve to sit across from you." David Chen was quiet for a moment, and then he did something that undid Daniel completely. He reached across the table and took Daniel's hand. "Do you know what I've learned?" David said. "From 20 years of treating dying children, I've learned that nobody is only one thing. I've watched terrified, selfish, broken people become the bravest souls I've ever known, right there at their child's bedside. I've watched people find in their worst moment a version of themselves they never knew existed." He squeezed Daniel's hand. "You didn't lose the man who jumped into the river. You buried him, and now you're digging him back up. That's not nothing, Daniel. That's the hardest thing a person can do." He smiled through his tears. "The man who pulled me out of that water was capable of running toward the hard, frightening thing instead of away from it. And from what I hear about what you've been doing this past year, that man is still very much alive." The two of them sat in that diner for 3 hours. Daniel told David everything. The company, the cruelty, the ballroom Emily, the loading dock, the cleaning crew, Maria Delgado, all of it. And David listened the way a good doctor listens without judgment. And when Daniel was finished, David said, "I'd like to be your friend Daniel, if you'll let me. Not because you saved my life, because I think the man you're becoming is a man worth knowing." And Daniel Whitmore, who 6 months earlier had realized he did not have a single friend in the entire world, felt something he had almost forgotten was possible. He felt not alone. The final 6 months passed differently than the first. Something had settled in Daniel. The desperate striving quality that had driven him his whole life was gone, and in its place was something quieter and stronger. He no longer worked to earn back his title. He worked because the work mattered, because the people mattered, because he had finally understood that a life is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you give and who you lift. He and David became close. They had dinner every week. David brought his wife and his little girl Grace and Daniel, who had never in his life imagined himself as the kind of man who would sit on a floor building block towers. With a 3-year-old found that it was the best part of his week. Grace called him Uncle Danny, and every time she said it, something in Daniel's chest that had been frozen for years thawed a little more. He kept working through the departments, and everywhere he went now, the reception was different. The story of Daniel Whitmore's transformation had become almost legend inside the company. People who had once feared and hated him now nodded to him in the halls. Frank from the loading dock invited him to his daughter's nursing school graduation, and Daniel went, and he cried when the girl crossed the stage because he knew how many double shifts Frank had worked to put her there. Tyler asked Daniel for advice about going back to school himself, and Daniel not only gave him advice, he quietly paid for the boys' first semester and told no one, and it got out anyway, the way good deeds sometimes do, and it changed the way 100 more people saw him. Sandra from accounting. The woman he had made cry invited him to her retirement party, and in front of everyone she stood up and said, "I hated this man for 2 years, and then I watched him become someone worth respecting. And if he can change, then maybe there's hope for all of us." And she hugged him, and the whole room applauded, and Daniel could barely see through his tears, and Maria Delgado. One afternoon, Maria came to find Daniel, and she wasn't alone. There was a boy with her, 7 years old when Daniel had endangered his life 9, now healthy, grinning, full of energy. Mateo. "I told you that you should meet him someday," Maria said, "when you were ready." She looked at Daniel, and there was something in her face that had not been there before, something like peace. "I think you're ready." Mateo looked up at Daniel with the frank, fearless curiosity of a child. "My mom says you did a bad thing," the boy said, "and then you said sorry, and then you got better." Daniel knelt down to the boy's level. "That's exactly right," he said, his voice thick. "I did do a bad thing, to your mom, and I've been trying very hard to be better ever since." Mateo considered this with great seriousness. "My soccer coach says everybody messes up," he announced. "He says what matters is if you keep trying." He paused. "Are you going to keep trying?" Daniel Whitmore looked at this boy, this living, breathing, laughing boy, whose life he had once put in danger with the careless flick of a hand, and he made him a promise. "Every single day," he said, "for the rest of my life, I promise." Mateo nodded, satisfied, and then, because he was 9, he immediately asked if Daniel wanted to see the soccer trick he'd been practicing, and Daniel said yes, absolutely. And Maria stood back and watched the man who had wronged her play soccer in the office hallway with her son, and something that had been broken in her for 2 years finally fully healed. "I forgive you," she said quietly when Mateo ran off to get water. "All the way this time. I've been trying for 6 months, and I kept holding a little bit back. But watching you with him just now." She wiped her eyes. "I forgive you, Daniel, completely. Go be the man you're supposed to be." Daniel couldn't speak. He just took her hand and he held it, and the two of them stood there in the hallway, a woman who had suffered and a man who had caused it, bound, now not by that old wound, but by something far greater, by grace, by the almost unbelievable human capacity to forgive and to change and to begin again. And then, at last, the day of the vote arrived. 1 full year to the day since Daniel Whitmore had signed away his company in the ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. The employees of Whitmore Enterprises would decide by their own ballots whether he had earned the right to lead them again. Every single person who worked there got a vote. The executives, the loading dock crew, the cleaning staff, the billing department, everyone. Their voice, their choice, their judgment on whether a man who had wronged so many of them deserved a second chance at the top. Emily Carter had kept her word. She had not influenced it. She had not said a single thing to sway anyone. She had simply let the people who knew Daniel best, the people who had watched him at his worst, and then watched him transform, make their own decision. Daniel spent that day not campaigning, not worrying, but working. He was on the loading dock that morning helping Frank and Tyler unload a truck because that was where he'd started, and that was where he wanted to be while his fate was decided. And when Emily called him up to her office in the late afternoon, he took off his work gloves and he shook Frank's hand, and Frank said, "Whatever happens up there, son, you're all right by us, you hear me? You're all right by us." And Tyler nodded, and that, Daniel thought as he rode the elevator up, was worth more than any title in the world. Emily was waiting in her office. Richard was there too, and on the desk between them sat a sealed envelope containing the results of the vote. "Before I open this," Emily said, "I want to say something to you, Daniel, and I want you to hear it whatever the result turns out to be." She stood and she came around the desk and she looked him in the eye. A year ago, you threw a poor woman out of your building because you thought she was worthless. That poor woman was me. And in the years since, I have watched you become a completely different man. Not because you had to, not for the title, but because somewhere inside you, the good man you used to be was still alive, and he clawed his way back to the surface one hard, humble day at a time. Her voice softened. I made a bet on you a year ago. Richard thought I was a fool. Half of New York thought I'd lost my mind. But I bet that a cruel man could become a good one because I believe that's the most important thing a person can believe. And Daniel, whatever's in this envelope, you've already proven me right. You already won the thing that actually matters. You got your soul back, and no vote can take that away from you. Daniel could barely stand. Thank you, he whispered, for not destroying me when you had every right to, for giving me a door instead of a grave. You saved my life, Emily, in the way that actually counts. Emily smiled, and then she picked up the envelope. Are you ready? She asked. Daniel took a deep breath, and then he shook his head. You know what? He said, before you open it, there's something I need to say, because whichever way this goes, I mean it. He steadied himself. If they voted no, I understand. Completely. I hurt those people, and if they've decided they don't want me leading them, then they're right, and I'll respect it. And I'll keep working here at the bottom for as long as you'll have me, and I'll be grateful for it. And if they voted yes, his voice caught. If they voted yes, then I swear to you on David Chen's life, on Mateo Delgado's life, on the memory of the boy who jumped into that river, I will never again forget what it feels like to be at the bottom. I will lead that company for the people who clean its floors and unload its trucks and answer its phones because I finally know that they are the company. Not me, them. He looked at Emily. Okay? Now open it. Emily Carter opened the envelope. She read it silently. Her face gave nothing away. The seconds stretched out unbearably. Richard leaned forward. Daniel's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. And then Emily looked up, and her eyes were shining, and she said one word. Yes. Daniel's knees nearly gave out. Yes, Daniel, Emily said, and now she was smiling through tears. They voted yes, and not by a little. It wasn't close. 87% of your employees voted to have you lead them again. The loading dock, the cleaning crew, billing, accounting. Sandra voted yes. Frank voted yes. Maria Delgado voted yes. Her voice broke. The people you hurt the most voted to give you the chance to lead them because they watched you become a man worth following. Do you understand what that means? You didn't earn this with money or charm or power. You earned it the only way that's real. You earned it with character. Daniel Whitmore sat down heavily in the chair, and he put his face in his hands, and he wept. And this time Emily let him and Richard old hard. Richard had to turn away and pretend to look out the window because even he could not hold it together. And when Daniel finally lifted his head, he was not the man who had walked into that building a year ago. That man was gone forever. In his place was someone new, someone who had been broken all the way down and rebuilt from the foundation, up someone who finally understood the thing his rescuer had known at 6 years old and Emily's father had known his whole life and Daniel had taken 40 years to learn. That a human being's worth has nothing to do with what they own. The years that followed were the best of Daniel Whitmore's life. He led Whitmore Enterprises, and he led it like no CEO had ever led it before. The first thing he did was create a rule that every executive, including himself, had to spend 2 weeks a year working in the lowest paid positions in the company, on the loading dock, on the cleaning crew, in customer service, so that no one who made decisions about people's lives could ever again forget that those people were human. He raised the lowest wages before he raised his own salary. He created a fund for employees facing medical crises so that no parent would ever again have to choose between their job and their sick child. And he named it the Mateo Fund, and Maria Delgado cried when he told her. He kept working with David Chen, and together they built a foundation that provided treatment for children whose families couldn't afford it. And over the years, that foundation saved the lives of hundreds of children. And Daniel understood that every one of them was in a way a ripple from a single moment 20 years earlier when a young man had jumped into a frozen river. He and Emily became over time real friends. The kind of friend Daniel had never had in his old life when he was surrounded by people who wanted his money. Because Emily had never wanted anything from him, except for him to become a better man, and that he came to understand was the rarest and most valuable kind of friendship there is. Emily, for her part, eventually stopped living her double life. She had gotten what she went looking for. She had proven to herself through Daniel the thing she had needed to believe, that people could change, that kindness could reach into even the hardest heart and call out the good that was buried there, that her father had been right about the world after all. And so she stepped fully into her role at the head of Carter Global Holdings, and she used that vast fortune the way her father would have wanted to lift people up, to give chances to those who didn't deserve them, because grace that has to be earned isn't grace at all. But she never forgot the lessons of her 3 years living as an ordinary woman. She kept a pair of worn, resoled shoes in her closet, and every so often, when she needed to remember, she took them out and held them, and she thought about all the invisible people rushing through the cold streets of the city. Every one of them a whole universe, every one of them worthy of dignity, every one of them capable of being the stranger who saves your life or the child you pull from the river. And sometimes on quiet mornings, Emily Carter still put on plain clothes and rode the subway and stood in line at ordinary shops among ordinary people, not to test anyone anymore, but simply to remember. To stay close to the truth she had almost lost when she inherited her fortune. That the person standing next to you, the one in the worn coat and the tired shoes, the one everyone else looks right through, might be the most important person in the room, might be a hidden heiress, might be a doctor who saves children, might be a mother who fought a war for her son and won, might be anyone, might be everyone. Years later, an interviewer asked Daniel Whitmore what had changed him. He was an old man by then, gray-haired, respected not for his wealth, but for the lives he had touched. And the interviewer expected him to talk about the vote, or the ballroom, or the loss of his company. Instead, Daniel smiled and he said, "A woman spilled coffee on my jacket, and I laughed at her shoes, and it turned out she owned my entire future." He paused. "But that's not really what changed me. What changed me is that she had every reason in the world to destroy me, and she chose to save me instead. She looked at the worst version of a man, and she believed there was a better one hiding underneath, and she was willing to bet everything to find out if she was right." His eyes grew distant. "I spent the first 40 years of my life believing that a person's value was written on a price tag. And a poor woman in worn-out shoes taught me the truth, that the measure of a person is not their clothes or their job or the size of their bank account. It's how they treat the people they think can do nothing for them. It's who they are when they believe nobody important is watching." He looked directly into the camera then. "Somebody is always watching," he said, "and even if they're not, you should be. Because the person you look down on today may be the person who saves you tomorrow, and the kindness you give away when you expect nothing in return is the only wealth you actually get to keep." Daniel Whitmore had learned the hardest lesson of his life, and he had learned it late, but he had learned it completely. Emily Carter had risked everything on a broken man, and her faith had been repaid 1,000 times over. Maria Delgado had chosen to set down the stone of her anger, and she had raised a son who believed that people could be more than the worst thing they ever did. David Chen had carried the memory of a stranger's courage for 20 years, and he had turned it into a lifetime of saving children. And a single act of grace given by a woman everyone had looked down on, to a man who deserved none of it, had rippled outward across the years and touched more lives than anyone could ever count. Because true greatness was never found in wealth. It was never found in power. It was found always and only in character. And the poorest-looking woman in the room turned out to be the richest soul any of them had ever known.